Let's face it, many of us will arrive somewhere, wander about, spot something vaguely interesting, lift our camera and snap. This is Graham Wilson, and in this video for the Bronze Photography course Part 2, we're going to look at a different approach. Before we even start, a quick aside. When we go somewhere new or do something different, do some research. Do a search using Google Images, Flickr, Getty or Alamy for the place, the type of place or the type of event. You aren't wanting to copy the pictures, but you are trying to get ideas. Think of creating a concept or mood board with Pinterest. It only takes a few minutes to do so. Quickly flick through your search and only pin the shots that really catch your eye. This image is typical of the remarkable work of the British photographer Martin Parr, a member of the very prestigious and influential Magnum photo collective. Parr straddles the fence between snapshots and artwork. Many parents will have a picture of their kid with a face mess, but Parr's use of saturated colour, accentuated by the ring flash that he uses, and focus. Notice that the foreground is fairly sharp, but not the backdrop. All of this takes it from a snapshot to a work of art. The term composition, taken literally, means putting together. In photography, as in all the visual arts, it is used to sum up the conscious organisation of the parts of an image according to some established principles of art. The principles have evolved over hundreds of years, and today we even begin to understand how humans prefer some aesthetic elements like this and why they don't like others. The composition of a picture is different from its subject. The subject is the main thing that's being photographed. Two photographers can take pictures of the same thing and have wildly different interpretations using different composition. Some people, well actually most people, arrive somewhere, get off the train or whatever, grab their camera and take quick pictures, pointing their cameras straight at whatever it is that catches their eye. The better photographer, the artist, like you, will think before they shoot. They see something, they walk around it, they look it up and down, they go up to it and walk back from it. They look at the direction of the sun and any shadows that it's casting. They might look beyond it to see what will be behind it if they take a picture from this angle or another. They notice what people, cars and other moving objects do when they're near it. Eventually, they raise their camera, adjust the settings, and take some carefully composed images. Why? Well, if nothing else, a well-composed picture will create a much better memory of the place than a snapshot. It will be something that they can share with their friends with pride. So what is the photographer considering when they engage in composition? There are a handful of elements that can make a picture stand out. Line is the visual path that draws the eye within the photo. We talk about leading lines, which is where lines are created in the image that lead the eye of the viewer towards the main subject. If they're strong enough, we don't even need a subject because the lines become it. Shape. Any areas with their edges within the photo, whether geometric or organic, are a shape. Lines don't have to be straight, and when they are created by the boundary between two things, they become a shape. So the photographer is looking for shapes. Often a picture of a building is bland because the photographer has tried to include the whole thing in the picture. By walking up to it or zooming in if they're using a zoom lens, they can take a much more powerful picture by concentrating on one side of the building and whatever's beside it, whether it's sky, a footpath or another building. Colour, both the hue, red, yellow, blue, violet, whatever, and the intensity of the colour are very important aspects of composition. While pictures with bright colours often seem to be the most striking, it's surprising how muted colours can actually be much more memorable. There's a psychological reason for this, but we won't dwell on that. For the time being, remember that there's often a great shot to be found when we look for muted colours and isolate them away from the bright ones. Think of a misty morning with fog over fields and how that picture can be more engaging than the same shot on a sunny day. The next element is texture. Texture is the surface quality that creates an illusion of what it will feel like if we touch it. Isolating things is a good compositional tool. By separating them from other things around them, we can give them more interest. Ultimately, just the texture itself can be more provocative than anything else. A hedgerow, a cornfield, the shiny deck of a kayak, an area of someone's arm with the skin and hair, they're all more engaging very often than a picture of the whole scene. Another element is value. This is a strange one. The highlights and shadows that allow us to see things in 3D are known as the value of the light. When we shine a light directly on something, it makes it appear flatter. This is why on-camera flash, the little pop-up thing above your eyepiece, very often fails. This is because we rely on shadows as well as highlights to give us a sense of depth. The on-camera flash blacks light, removes the shadows, and so reduces the depth in the image. So often, something that appears bland in a snapshot can be made much more interesting by taking a side-on look to get more shadow and hence depth. Form, the length, width, or depth of something, effectively creates a three-dimensional image. Sometimes a straight-on shot is ideal. It's common in documentary work, but most things are actually 3D. So by moving around, again, we can find an angle that accentuates their form. And finally, space. How our frame is filled by objects and by the space between them can control the impression that the picture creates. I've mentioned the use of isolation as a way of accentuating texture. Well, space around something, or excluding space around it, can create a more impacting image. For example, imagine you've climbed up a bit of a hill. It's tempting to raise the camera up and photograph the scene complete with a chunk of sky. But instead, lowering the camera so only the ground and trees or fields in the near to middle distance are included can make for a better picture. It's hard to remember all of these elements, but start to look for them when you're taking your pictures. A quick reminder, the advantage of the half button press, which I described in week 1, is that it means that you can focus on something, hold the button halfway, and then move the camera to compose the image better. As long as the distance between you and the subject doesn't change, then it will still remain in sharp focus. So here are 3 quick rules to try and help us to compose our shots better. The rule of thirds has to be the most commonly referred to example of a composition guide, because it works. Instead of grabbing the camera and pointing straight at the subject, we focus on the subject but then reposition it by moving our camera slightly so that the subject is at one of the 4 intersections of thirds. If the subject is larger, then we still try to get it to take up 1/3, either vertically or horizontally. The unused space provides a backdrop that either creates context or serves to make the subject stand out. Many cameras come with a toggle in the menus to superimpose a 3x3 grid in the viewfinder to make this easier to achieve. The second rule to mention is the importance of focusing on the closest part of the subject to you. The picture of the brass player is a street photograph, and I only had a few seconds to grab it. She's wearing sunglasses, so instead of her eye, I had to focus on her nose. She's also pretty close to the rule of thirds. In the landscape, Ignacio Ferrez has composed it so that the rock in the foreground is also at roughly the intersection of the thirds. But importantly, that rock is in sharp focus. If it hadn't been, the image would have lost its impact. And finally, for today, leading lines. Strictly speaking, this is where lines within the image lead the viewer's eye to the subject of interest. A really powerful use of leading lines is where they become the subject itself. You often see this in architectural photography. Unfortunately, many people take landscape images that rely on leading lines, but they aren't strong enough on their own, and the photographer then fails to include a strong foreground element. In this picture, by Vinoth Chandar, which is essentially an architectural image, the leading lines carry our eyes along the corridor, but he's placed the monkey in the lower left box created by the rules of thirds, and he's focused on the monkey rather than the corridor. There was quite a lot to take in this video, so let's finish with a quick summary. Composition is about taking time to think about our photographs. It's the difference between a snapshot and a proper photograph. It involves pulling together elements such as texture, colour, shape and light to create a more powerful picture. 3 easy rules, of many, help us to make quick decisions. Firstly, the rule of thirds places the subject away from the centre of the frame. Secondly, focusing on the nearest part of the subject creates intimacy and gives us foreground interest to an otherwise vague scene. And finally, 3, using leading lines we can draw the eye and the mind of the viewer to the subject of interest, or create one in themselves.